The year was 1872, and the snow came down like a final judgment. It covered the plains in a great white sheet, muffling the world until the only sound left was the wind moaning like a lost soul. Through that silence walked Aya Whitmore. Her boots were paper-thin, her shawl a pathetic joke against the cold. She was a ghost in the grey dusk, with bruises crawling up her arms like old faded ink. Hunger was a fire in her belly, shame was a stone in her heart, and the words she'd been practicing for days felt like ash in her mouth. Her husband's family had thrown her out, called her barren, worthless. The neighbors' whispers followed her like stray dogs, nipping at her heels. So she walked toward the only rumor she had left. A silent man, they said. A man who lived at the edge of the world, too strange and lonesome to ever take a wife. But steady. Steady as the mountains themselves. His name was Alistis Boone. If he turned her away, the snow would be her only blanket. The cabin was small, a dark shape against the pines, with a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. It looked like the loneliest place on earth. She got to the door, raised a trembling hand to knock, but it swung open before her knuckles could touch the wood. He filled the entire doorway, tall, broad, his face carved from stone and shadow. Alistis Boone. His eyes were like rocks at the bottom of a cold river, and they gave nothing away. Not kindness, not cruelty, nothing. He looked at her, this broken thing on his doorstep, and the silence stretched on forever. She had to force the words past the fear in her throat. "I am too hurt and weak to love, sir," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. "But I can cook." He just stared. The wind howled, and she thought, this is it. This is where I die. He's going to shut the door and leave me to the wolves. But then, without a single word, he just stepped aside. A nod. That was all. Permission to enter. She stumbled across the threshold, and the warmth hit her like a physical blow. The smell of wood smoke and old leather and something else. Safety. The cabin was a man's space, tools on the wall, a rifle in the corner. The table was scarred but clean. No softness, no frills, just solitude. She set down her tiny bundle of belongings and waited for him to speak. He didn't even look at her. He just walked to the hearth, stirred the embers, and the fire glowed a little brighter. Only then did he turn, his voice a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "Sit." One word, but it felt like a pardon from the governor. Her legs were shaking so bad she almost fell into the chair. He ladled stew from a pot hanging over the fire and set the bowl in front of her. No questions, no prying. He just gave her food. Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon. It was just venison and potatoes, but to her starving body it tasted like salvation. She ate while trying to hide the tears rolling down her cheeks. He moved around the cabin, mending a piece of leather, his presence as quiet and solid as an old oak tree. When she was done, she didn't wait to be told. She took the bowl, the pot, and washed them until they gleamed in the firelight. She swept the floor. Her mother had taught her a woman's worth was in her hands, and right now that was the only truth she had left to cling to. Alistis watched her. His face was still a mask, impossible to read. But when she finished, he took his own heavy wool coat from a peg and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her whole, smelling of pine trees and horses and the cold night air. The simple weight of it was an kindness so unexpected it stole her breath. "Thank you," she whispered. He just grunted and went back to his work. That night he made her a small bed in the corner. As she drifted off to sleep, exhausted to her bones, she saw her tattered shawl lying by the hearth, and she noticed something strange. The torn seam, the one that had let the wind in, had been crudely stitched back together. A needle and thread still lay beside it. He had fixed it while she slept, and she realized the silence in this cabin wasn't empty. It was full of things he would never say. The days fell into a rhythm. She'd wake before him, start the coffee, bake bread from their meager supplies. He'd chop wood with an unnerving speed and efficiency, the sound of his axe a steady drumbeat in the cold morning air. He never said much. More coffee. Storms coming. But his actions were a language all their own. He mended the sole of her boot when he thought she wasn't looking. He started leaving the largest piece of meat on her plate, taking less for himself. But the shame was a stubborn ghost. She had to go into town for flour one day, and the stares of the people felt like a physical assault. She saw the midwife, Clara May, looking at her with pity. Then she heard the whispers at the general store. "That's the one Alistista Boone took in. Baron, they say. He'll regret it. A broken horse is still a broken horse." Her cheeks burned with a heat the winter couldn't touch. She grabbed the flour and fled, her head down. When she got back to the cabin, Alistista saw her red-rimmed eyes. He didn't ask what was wrong. He never did. But that night, when she went to her bed, she found a small sprig of green pine lying on her pillow. A silent message. In this house, their whispers don't matter. Still, the secret festered inside her. The bruises on her arms had faded, but the ones on her heart hadn't. She kept waiting for the kindness to run out, waiting for him to see her as everyone else did, a failure. One evening, she was humming an old song her mother used to sing, her voice soft as falling snow. Alistista was sharpening his hunting knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the room. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. She looked up. He was just listening. His head was tilted, and for a fleeting second, the corner of his mouth twitched, as if he was trying to remember how to smile. The moment passed, and he went back to his knife, but it left a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. Maybe, just maybe, he saw something more than a barren woman. But her body was a traitor. She'd been working all day, giving him the larger portions, living on scraps herself to make the food last. She was leaning over the fire, stirring the stew, when the world went black at the edges. The room tilted. She swayed, the spoon clattering from her hand onto the stone hearth. She was falling, but she never hit the floor. Two powerful arms caught her, scooping her up as if she weighed nothing. Her eyes fluttered open, and Alistista's face was right there, inches from hers. His jaw was clenched tight, but his eyes, they weren't filled with anger or annoyance. It was something else, something fierce, protective. He carried her to her bed and laid her down gently. He pulled the quilt up to her chin and then just knelt there, a silent guardian, until her breathing evened out. The firelight flickered across his stony features. "I am not worth the trouble," she whispered, the words she'd been holding back since the day she arrived. His gaze was unwavering, and for the first time since she met him, his voice lost its gravelly edge. It was soft, and it was broken. "You'll not starve again under my roof," he vowed. "Not ever." And she knew he wasn't just talking about food. He was offering her a sanctuary, a place where her worth wasn't measured by the children she couldn't have. He was offering her a home. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel alone. But as she drifted to sleep, a cold thought slithered into her mind. This kindness was a fragile thing. What secret was this silent man hiding? Why did a man this strong and capable live like a hermit? The town didn't just gossip about her, they feared him, and she was beginning to understand that she hadn't just stumbled into a stranger's cabin. She had walked into the middle of a story that had started long before she arrived, and she had a terrifying feeling that the final chapter was going to be written in blood. The winter began to lose its grip, but the chill inside the cabin had nothing to do with the weather. The quiet rhythm they'd found was now laced with a new kind of tension. Aya found herself watching him, really watching him, when he didn't know she was looking. She'd see him staring out the window at the snow-covered fields, his hand clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles were white. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she'd hear him whisper a name in his sleep, a woman's name, Eleonora. Who was Eleonora? His kindness continued, a steady, unspoken river. He built her a small bookshelf next to her bed and filled it with 2 books he'd bought in town, a collection of poems and a worn copy of Shakespeare. He never mentioned them. They just appeared one day, like the pine sprig. But now, these gestures felt different. They felt like an apology for a crime she didn't know he'd committed. One afternoon, she was cleaning out the small pantry when her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard at the back. Curiosity, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, took hold. She pried it up. Underneath was a small, dust-covered wooden box. It wasn't locked. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a child's silver locket and a small, leather-bound diary. Her hands trembled as she opened the diary. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The entries spoke of love for a quiet, strong man, of the joy of building a home at the edge of the wilderness, of the thrill of feeling a new life kicking inside her. The name signed at the bottom of each entry was Eleonora Boone, his wife. Aya felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just his house, it was their house. She was sleeping in a home haunted by the ghost of a happy marriage. She kept reading, her eyes flying across the pages. The entries grew more frantic. They spoke of a man in town, Ezekiel Carter, the same man who sneered at her in the church. Eleonora wrote that Carter was obsessed with their land, that he kept trying to buy it, making threats. She wrote that she was afraid of him. The last entry was short, the handwriting jagged and rushed. Ezekiel was here again. Alistista is in the high pastures. The baby is coming. I smell smoke. The diary ended there. Aya slammed the book shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire. The town whispered that Alistista had lost his wife and child in a fire. They blamed him. But it wasn't his fault. It was Ezekiel Carter. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, just as the cabin door swung open. Alistista stood there, covered in snow from his ride. He saw the open floorboard. He saw the box in her hands. He saw the diary. The color drained from his face. The stony mask he always wore didn't just crack, it shattered. For a single, terrifying moment, she saw pure, unadulterated rage in his eyes. A rage so profound, it made the room feel 10 degrees colder. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, not in kindness, but like a claw. "What have you done?" he snarled, and the voice was not the quiet rumble she knew. It was the growl of a wounded animal. She scrambled backward, holding the diary like a shield. I didn't know," she stammered. "Get out," he whispered, his voice shaking with a grief so raw it was terrifying to witness. "Get out of my house." He was casting her out, just like everyone else. The hope she had so carefully nurtured turned to ice in her veins. She had unearthed his greatest pain, and he was going to make her pay for it. She had nowhere to go. The snow was falling again, thicker this time. A blizzard was coming. He was giving her a death sentence. She stared at the man she thought she was coming to know, and saw only a stranger, his face twisted by a past he had tried to bury. And she realized the whispers of the town weren't just malicious gossip. They were a warning she had failed to heed. She had run from one monster straight into the lair of another. Tears streamed down her face as she backed away from him. He pointed a trembling finger toward the door, his eyes blazing with a cold fire she'd never seen before. He wasn't just angry, he was broken, and he was dangerous. "I said, get out," he repeated, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. She stumbled, grabbing her tattered shawl, her mind reeling. The warmth of the cabin felt like a lie, the brief moments of peace a cruel joke. She had been a fool to think this man was her savior. He was just as damaged as she was, but his wounds were deeper, sharper, and they were about to cut her to pieces. She scrambled for the door, her hands fumbling with the latch. The wind outside screamed like a banshee, tearing at the cabin, promising a frozen grave. She risked one last look back at him. He hadn't moved. He was just standing there, a silhouette of grief and rage, the ghosts of his dead wife and child swirling around him. The look on his face told her everything. He hated her. He hated her for digging up the past. He hated her for being alive when his Eleonora was dead. The door flew open, and the blizzard consumed her. The cold was a physical shock, stealing the air from her lungs. She took a step, then another, into the blinding white chaos. The last thing she heard before the storm swallowed all sound was the cabin door slamming shut behind her, a final, definitive sound of rejection. She was alone again. And this time, there was no one left to run to. The snow was a wall of white. It was in her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. Every breath was a shard of ice. Aya couldn't see more than 2 feet in front of her. The cabin had vanished instantly, as if it had never existed. There was no up, no down, just a swirling, howling vortex of white. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She tried to shout Alistista's name, but the wind snatched the word from her lips and tore it to shreds. She was going to die out here. She was going to freeze to death just yards from the shelter she'd been so brutally ejected from. Her anger at him was a small, flickering ember against the overwhelming inferno of fear. She stumbled forward, her thin boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. Which way was the road? Which way was the town? It was miles away. She'd never make it. She tripped over something hidden beneath the snow, a fallen branch maybe, and went down hard, the impact knocking the last of the air from her body. She lay there, the snow piling up on top of her like a fresh grave blanket. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, to let the cold take her. It was a strange, seductive thought. No more pain, no more shame, no more running. But then she thought of the diary. She thought of Eleonora, trapped and afraid, smelling smoke. She thought of Ezekiel Carter's smug, cruel face. And a new feeling, one she hadn't felt in a very long time, pushed through the despair. Rage. White-hot, blistering rage. She would not die like this. She would not let that man Ezekiel win. She would not let Alistista's grief be her executioner. Using her raw hands, she pushed herself up. The wind shoved her back down. She got up again. She was on her hands and knees, crawling, with no idea where she was going. She was just moving. A blind, desperate animal, refusing to be put down. The bruises on her arms, long since faded, seemed to ache with a phantom pain, reminding her of all the times she had been beaten down and gotten back up. Then she heard it. A sound that wasn't the wind. A heavy, rhythmic crunching. Something was coming. Her first thought was a wolf or a bear woken from its slumber. She froze, huddled in the snow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. A dark shape emerged from the white maelstrom. It was huge, a monster from a nightmare. As it got closer, she could see it was a man on a horse. The man was a giant, wrapped in thick furs, his face obscured by the driving snow. But she recognized the horse. It was Alistista's big roan Bess. It was him. He reined the horse to a halt just a few feet away. He swung down from the saddle, his movements fluid and powerful. He walked toward her, and she flinched, expecting a blow, another harsh word. He knelt in the snow in front of her. He reached out, not with a fist, but with an open hand, and gently brushed the snow from her hair. His eyes, barely visible in the blizzard's gloom, were not filled with rage anymore. They were filled with a terrible, gut-wrenching shame. He didn't speak. He just scooped her up into his arms, his wool coat scratching against her frozen cheek. He carried her back to the horse, mounted with her held tight against his chest, and turned the horse around. His body shielded her from the worst of the wind, his warmth a shocking contrast to the deadly cold. When they got back to the cabin, he carried her inside and set her down in the chair by the fire. He stripped off her wet, frozen shawl and boots and wrapped her in the thickest, warmest blanket he owned. He stoked the fire until it roared. Then he handed her a steaming mug of coffee. Her hands were shaking too hard to hold it. He knelt before her again, took the mug, and held it to her lips himself. She drank, the hot liquid a blessed relief. They stayed like that for a long time, in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the screaming of the wind outside. Finally, he spoke. His voice was raw, scraped clean of all its defenses. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Aya." She just looked at him, tears freezing on her eyelashes. "When I saw you with that box," he continued, his gaze fixed on the fire, "I saw her. I saw everything I lost, and I broke." He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was a bottomless well. "The town thinks I didn't get back in time, that I let the fire take them. Some of them, like Carter, they whisper that I started it." "It was him," Aya said, her voice hoarse. "Ezekiel Carter. It's in the diary. He was threatening her. She smelled smoke." Alistister's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "I know. I've always known, but I have no proof. The marshal said it was an accident, a fallen lantern. Carter's family owns half the valley. Their word against a silent, grieving man. It was no contest." He stood up and began to pace the cabin like a caged lion. "I took a vow of silence the day I buried them. I swore I wouldn't speak again until I had justice for Eleonora and my boy, Samuel. But the years went by. The silence became a habit, a prison, and the hate just festered." He stopped and turned to face her. "Then you showed up, bruised and broken and running from something. You filled this empty house with life, and it scared me. I started to feel things I thought were long dead, and I knew, if I let you in, I was putting you in danger. Carter saw you with me in town. He knows I've let someone in. He won't stand for it." A cold dread washed over Aya. "He's the one I was running from. Not my in-laws. It was him. He was one of them." Alistister went perfectly still. The air in the cabin crackled with a sudden violent energy. "One of who?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "The men," she whispered, shame and fear making it hard to speak. "The men who hurt me before I was married. My family covered it up. They paid him to be quiet. Then my husband died, and Carter, he thought I was his to claim. That's why I ran. I never knew his name was Carter. I just knew his face." Alistister Boone closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the grief was gone, replaced by something far older and far more terrifying. It was the calm, cold certainty of a man who had just found his purpose. The vow of silence was broken. The prison door was open, and the monster was out. "He won't touch you again," Alistister said, and it wasn't a promise, it was a prophecy. "This ends now. He took my family. He tried to take my name. He will not take my home." He walked to the corner and picked up his rifle. He checked the action, his movements economical and precise. He was no longer just a rancher, he was a hunter, and the blizzard outside was no longer a threat, it was an advantage. Because while Ezekiel Carter was safe and warm in town, thinking he had won, justice was saddling up its horse and riding out into the storm. And Aya knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that by morning only one of them would be left standing. The storm raged all night, a physical manifestation of the fury that had been unleashed in the cabin. Alistister didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, oiling the action, his movements filled with a terrifying calm. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was the charged silence of two soldiers before a battle. They were allies, bound by a shared enemy and a shared pain. Aya watched him, her fear for his safety, warring with a fierce, burning pride. This man, who had been buried alive by grief, was digging his way out. Not for revenge, but for her. For the home they had accidentally started to build together. She got up, took a needle and thread, and began mending the tear in his canvas jacket, her stitches small and even. It was a small act, but it was all she had to give, a silent prayer for his return. Just before dawn, the wind began to die down. The world outside was a blanket of pristine, undisturbed white. Alcestis stood up, the rifle in his hand. He looked at her, his riverstone eyes holding a depth of emotion he could never have expressed with words. "Barricade the door after I leave," he said, his voice a low command. "Don't open it for anyone but me." She just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He pulled on his heavy coat, the one he had once draped over her shoulders. He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "Aya," he said, and her name on his lips for the first time was both a shock and a comfort. "When this is over," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He didn't have to. She understood. He slipped out the door and vanished into the blue-grey light of dawn, a ghost, moving through a world of snow and silence. Aya did as he said. She dragged the heavy wooden table in front of the door and pushed the armchair against it. She checked the small pistol Alcestis kept in a drawer, her hands surprisingly steady. She was no longer the frightened creature who had arrived on his doorstep. She was the keeper of the flame, the guardian of the home, and she would defend it. Hours crawled by. The sun rose, casting a blinding glare off the snow. The silence was absolute, unnerving. Every creak of the cabin, every pop of the fire made her jump. She kept picturing Alcestis lying dead in the snow. She pictured Ezekiel Carter, his cruel sneer triumphant. Around noon, she heard it. Horses, more than one. She peered through a small crack in the window shutter. It wasn't Alcestis. It was three men, their figures dark against the snow, and leading them was Ezekiel Carter. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and a confident, predatory swagger. He was coming to finish what he started. They dismounted, their boots crunching in the snow. Carter strode right up to the door and hammered on it with his fist. "Aya! I know you're in there. Your silent protector went into town looking for me. He won't be coming back. The marshal has him locked up for making threats. Now you open this door, or we'll burn this place to the ground, just like we did last time." Aya's blood ran cold. A trap. It had all been a trap. Alcestis had walked right into it. Carter had used her as bait, knowing Alcestis would come for him. "You hear me, woman?" Carter bellowed. "This ranch belongs to me now, and so do you." His men laughed, a ugly, guttural sound that made her skin crawl. One of them produced a torch and a flask of oil. They were serious. They were going to burn her alive. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the pistol in her hand. It was small, with only a few shots. There were three of them. She was trapped. But then she remembered the diary. She remembered Eleonora's fear. She remembered Alcestis' face when he saw the box. This house wasn't just wood and stone. It was a tomb. It was a monument to a love that had been stolen, and she would not let it burn again. She ran to the hearth and grabbed the heavy iron poker. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the rage was bigger. It was a fire, and it was burning away the last of the victim she used to be. "You want this house, Carter?" she screamed, her voice raw and surprisingly loud. "You'll have to come through me." Carter laughed again. "That can be arranged." She heard the sound of a heavy log being used as a battering ram against the door. The wood groaned, splintering. The table scraped against the floor. They were coming in. This was it. The door crashed open, torn from its hinges. Carter stood there, framed in the doorway, a look of triumph on his face. Behind him, his two thugs grinned, one of them holding the lit torch. "Well, well," Carter sneered, his eyes roaming over her. "Looks like the mouse has teeth." He took a step inside. Aya gripped the poker, her knuckles white. But just as Carter crossed the threshold, another sound cut through the air, a low, menacing whistle. Carter froze. He knew that sound. He spun around, his face paling. Standing behind his two men, not 20 yards away, was a Leicester Boone. He wasn't in the town jail, he was here, and he wasn't holding a rifle. In his hands was a massive wood-cutting axe, its blade gleaming in the winter sun. He hadn't gone to town for the marshal. He'd gone into the woods. He had circled back. He had hunted them. "You were saying, Carter?" Alistair's voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried an edge of lethal promise that made the air itself seem to vibrate. The two thugs turned, their grins vanishing, replaced by looks of pure terror. They had come for a helpless woman. They had not come to fight the ghost of Boone Ranch. One of them dropped his rifle in the snow and bolted. The other, the one with the torch, threw it aside and scrambled after him, slipping and falling in his haste to get away. Now, it was just Carter and Alistair. Carter fumbled to raise his rifle, but he was shaking. Alistair started walking toward him, slow and deliberate, the axe held loosely at his side. He was a force of nature, an avalanche in motion. "This is between you and me, Boone," Carter stammered, backing away. "It always has been." "You brought her into it," Alistair said, his voice dropping even lower. "You put your hands on her, you came to my home." With each sentence he took another step. "You burned my wife. You killed my son." Step. "You took my voice." Step. "You won't take anything else." He was 5 feet away now. Carter finally managed to raise the rifle and fire. The shot was deafening in the silence, but it went wide, kicking up a puff of snow near Alistair's feet. He didn't even flinch. Before Carter could fire again, Alistair closed the distance. He didn't use the axe blade. He swung it around, using the heavy, flat back of the axe head, and slammed it into Carter's gun, shattering the stock and sending the rifle flying. He dropped the axe in the snow. This wasn't going to be a killing. It was going to be a reckoning. Alistair's fist connected with Carter's jaw, a single brutal punch that sounded like a tree branch snapping. Carter crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the snow. It was over. Silence descended again, broken only by the sound of Alistair's heavy breathing. He stood over Carter's prone body for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. He looked at Aya standing in the ruined doorway, clutching the poker. He looked at the splintered door, the overturned table. He walked up to her, his face unreadable. He gently took the iron poker from her hands and set it by the hearth. Then his hands, calloused and scarred, came up to cup her face. His thumb brushed away a tear she didn't even know she'd shed. "It's over," he whispered. "You're safe." She leaned into his touch, a sob escaping her lips. It was a sound of grief, of relief, of 1,000 emotions she couldn't name. He pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to tear her apart. He held her just as tightly. Two broken people, standing in the ruins of a broken home, finally whole. The marshal did come out later that day, not to arrest Alistair, but to take Ezekiel Carter away, with Carter's men willing to talk in exchange for leniency and the discovery of Eleonora's diary. The truth that had been buried for years was finally coming to light. The whispers about Alistair Boone began to change. They were no longer whispers of fear, but of awe and respect. As spring finally arrived, melting the last of the snow, Alistista and Aya rebuilt the door, stronger this time. They worked side by side, their silence no longer a barrier, but a comfortable shared language. Love, they discovered, wasn't something that was declared with loud words and grand gestures. It was something that was built, day by day, with quiet acts of service, with shared glances across a dinner table, with the steady, unspoken promise of a hand to hold in the dark. One evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Aya placed her hand over his. "You gave me a home," she said softly. Alistista turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "No," he said, his voice the quiet rumble she had come to love. "You were the home. I was just the house." They sat there in the twilight, two survivors who had found in each other not just a refuge from the storm, but a reason to believe in the sun again. They had faced down their ghosts, and in the silence that followed, they had finally found their song. If you believe that even the most broken souls can find their way back to the light, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss another story. Thanks for listening.